We're recording.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jordan Mollenauer, and I want to welcome you to the study committee for the Career and Technical Education and Workforce Development, essentially a subcommittee, but a study committee of the State Board of Education. This has been formed at the request of Chairwoman Hartgrove, and I want to mention that we will have a few other board members dialing in and out of the call today, but I believe we have, looks like Daryl Cobbins with us. Bob Eby will be here shortly. And again, we may have a couple of others who join us in time. It also looks like we have a few people from the Department of Education who we will introduce here momentarily. Let me read the statement of purpose briefly for this study committee. It is to research and suggest opportunities to advance Tennessee's K through 12 students as those students progress through the stages of planning, preparation, and pursuit of their career aspirations. And those recommendations will be made to the full board at a later time. I want to make a quick note and reminder that we're here today to advocate on the behalf of students. As an employer myself, I have spent quite a bit of time studying this issue across our various businesses, but I want to emphasize that we're here today for the students and really to think about the opportunities and challenges through their eyes. So I would encourage everybody to be reminded of that. Also wanted to emphasize that this is going to be a very informal conversation. We're going to be very mission oriented, hopefully fast paced, and translate a lot of great dialogue back and forth. Also want to mention that we're going to have 4 different speakers today. We're going to have Sarah Williams from the Department of Education, who's going to be introduced here shortly. Dr. Amy Owen on the call already. Eric Olmstead also on the call already, and then Dr. Keith Wilson from Knox County Schools. So we'll provide a little bit more context on each of those presenters here momentarily. If you have questions today, please go ahead and just raise your hand or even interrupt to present that question as we're real time. We are going to reserve some time at the end to make sure that we can dig deeper if time allows. So with that in mind, Amy, can you please introduce yourself and go ahead and then introduce our first speaker, Ms. Williams. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Dr. Amy Owen, Deputy Executive Director for the State Board of Education over Policy and Research. I'm very happy to speak with you all this afternoon and to help kick off this inaugural meeting of the study committee. We will have our regular members of Garrett Hamby, Daryl Cobbins, and Larry Jensen. Vice Chairman Eby has also joined us, and I know there's at least one other board member listening in on the call as well to just understand the background context. Our Executive Director, Dr. Sarah Morrison, is also on the call. So she, of course, will chime in as needed with questions and comments as well. Sarah Williams from the Department of Education, I believe Jack Powers is working to make sure that she is available and online here shortly. So if you would like, we could move forward with another presentation and then come back to her when she has joined us.
Sounds great. Dr. Owen, you're on a roll, so why don't you go ahead and start?
Great, thank you. Jack, do you have any updates before I begin?
No, I do not. Thank you to the chair for the flexibility here. I'm about to start making some phone calls. I was just speaking to her about an hour ago, so she may be having some technical difficulties or something, but we'll track it down and try to get right back on track, or stay on track rather.
Great. And Elizabeth, are you able to share the slides, or do you want me to post them?
It looks like they're loading. Do you see it now?
Okay. Oh, perfect timing. There they are. Thank you.
And you have presenting privileges.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to figure out, where do I advance them? I don't see the little bars that I usually see, Elizabeth. Okay, I can't see a way to advance them.
Amy, sorry to interrupt. Sarah did just message me and say that she is joining now.
Okay.
She's just gotten held up for a moment. Maybe while we're trying to figure out how to advance the slides, she will have joined.
Thank you. Well, I'll go ahead and talk through our agenda. We will have Sarah Williams from the CTE department at the Department of Education talk about the role of occupational teachers, which are a kind of CTE educator. We have both academic and occupational educators. Most of today's conversation is going to focus on understanding the role of occupational educators, I'll talk about existing rules and policies related to their work and also some potential legislative changes. We'll hear from Eric Olmstead at the Department of Education talking about some of the more nuts and bolts of how do people obtain occupational licensure and what challenges do they sometimes see at the state level. And then we'll have Dr. Wilson from Knox County give us the district level perspective of what are the challenges and areas of growth and what has Knox County done to try to assist with getting this population of folks licensed and ready to be in the classroom. Elizabeth, could you advance to the next slide, please?
Do you not see it on your end?
No, not at all. I see the slides. I don't see the usual little arrows I get.
Can you try the keyboard arrows?
Not going either. Oh, spacebar might have done it. All right, I'll go for spacebar. I just can't go backward. So we've had our introductions from Mr. Mollenauer, and I will leave it right here, Jack. Hopefully we'll have Sarah join us shortly. If we don't hear from her in just a moment, I'm happy to dive in.
She has the message on her screen right now that says moving chairs around. I think it's something like that. And she just messaged me that that little bar is at 90%. So hopefully WebEx has almost made room for her. Out of the spirit of staying on time, I think it's totally okay if Amy, if you want to launch into something else, unless
That's totally fine.
Participants.
Yeah. Elizabeth, I won't be able to go backward in the slides though, just so you know. I can only go forward.
Okay, yeah, I'm trying to see if I can find a workaround.
Thank you. So I'll talk about our current state board rules and policies related to occupational education. Now, again, this is a specific subset of career and technical education, and Sarah will tell us exactly what endorsement areas those are. So I'm going to go over the specific requirements in state board rule and policy, starting off with how a person in Tennessee would obtain a practitioner occupational license. To get us all on the same page, a practitioner license is your initial level license. It is valid for 3 years, and it can be renewed one time for a second 3-year period. After that, you need to advance to a professional level license, which lasts for 6 years. So again, we're going to start off talking about folks who are in Tennessee seeking to obtain this license. A prospective educator seeking a practitioner occupational license has to do a number of things. They must have at least a high school diploma. This is different than when we look at our academic area teachers who need at least a baccalaureate degree. But we recognize that for many occupational fields, a high school diploma and then some sort of specific technical training in their field is just as valuable and is going to give them just as much of a background as they need as someone who might have a more traditional BA or BS. They must be enrolled in a state board approved EdPrep provider that has a job embedded clinical practice. So that's a lot of very technical terms. Our EPPs, we have a little over 40 in the state, and ones that have a job embedded program mean that you get your license and you are teaching as the teacher of record in your classroom while you are taking courses at your EdPrep provider. So you have your license, you've started that 3-year period, but you're still taking courses. Your EdPrep provider must recommend you for your license. And then this is where it looks different from a teacher in an academic area. These individuals must have at least 5 years of relevant work experience out of the last 10 years. And the Department of Education, as Eric will get into later, defines what the requirements are for each area of endorsement, whether you are in welding or automotive repair, what looks like relevant work experience for you. And then if available, you hold an active industry certification for that area of endorsement, which again varies tremendously by the type of occupational field that you're in. Questions so far on how an individual in a career field in Tennessee who wants to get into teaching would go about doing so? Okay. Things are going to start getting tricky, as they often do with licensure questions. We also have pathways for prospective educators who are coming from another state. So these are people who are teaching in a CTE field in another state, or who have been trained in another state to come into Tennessee. The first pathway, the individual must again have at least a high school diploma. They have to have completed their ed prep provider in a state other than Tennessee and be recommended by that provider. So whereas the person in Tennessee can just be enrolled and have begun their course, if you are coming in here from another state, you must have completed your training already. In part, that's because it can be difficult to complete programs across state lines if you move while you're in the middle of something. Again, you have to hold an active industry certification. And if available, you must submit qualifying scores on any licensure requirements around pedagogy or your content area in the professional assessment policy. So that's the first pathway for out-of-state educators. The second pathway has similar requirements. The difference here is that rather than having to take the assessment as you're coming into Tennessee, this is for individuals who have not only completed their ed prep program in another state, but they also have an initial level license from the other state. So we are essentially saying that we accept the other state's licensure criteria as valid. We're not going to make you take another test when you get to Tennessee. That NASTEC is an interstate compact among states, recognizing each other's licensure processes. So the first pathway, you've completed your ed prep and they've recommended you. You also take an assessment and have your industry cert. The second pathway, you've again completed your ed prep and you have your industry cert, but rather than taking a test, you already have an initial level license from a state other than Tennessee. And then the final pathway deals with individuals from other states who already have a professional level license in that other state, who want to come into Tennessee and maintain that professional level license. So the first two were for someone who is on their initial level license from another state or don't have a license at all elsewhere. In this case, you have a professional level license from another state. You again need your high school diploma. It has to be from a state that is part of the NASDAQ compact, and you have to have the relevant industry certification. And then when we think about professional versus practitioner licenses, there are two ways for someone with an occupational teacher license to advance from a practitioner to their professional license. The first way is that you need 3 years of qualifying experience. You must complete your ed prep program. You have to have at least 30 professional development points, maintain your industry certification, and for all people who are seeking to do this now, you must take any required licensure assessments as well. The second option is if you came into the state several years ago, if you had a professional level license in another state, you would previously have been issued a practitioner level license in Tennessee. The law changed a few years ago, or even just a year ago, perhaps, to allow people who had the professional level license in another state to directly obtain a professional level license in Tennessee. So this second option here is really capturing people who came in when they had a professional license from somewhere else, they were given a practitioner license in Tennessee. In order to now advance to the professional license in Tennessee, all they have to do is go back and show, hey, I have this professional license from somewhere else. It didn't count when I came into the state, but now the law says it does. So that's the second option in terms of how to advance. There are some recent exciting opportunities related to occupational educators. One of the governor's first actions in 2019, and it had General Assembly support, was to establish an occupational educator scholarship program, which supports prospective occupational teachers who are seeking this particular license. The state board established rules to effectuate that program, and the Department of Education continues to work through how to implement this with the ed prep providers in the state that offer occupational training programs. And now LEAs, as we will hear from Knox County in a little bit, are able to apply to become ed prep providers on their own. You could do this technically for any subject area, but the two we've seen approved so far from Rutherford County and Knox County focus on occupational educator programs. And I know Dr. Wilson will talk about this a little later on. The reason these LEAs, these districts, decided to establish their own EdPrep provider program was to have a way to support people in their community who wanted to be able to become CTE teachers without incurring quite so many costs as going back to a traditional college or university, and to have that on-the-ground mentorship support from their district supporting them. So that's another option, and any school district, or I believe partnerships of school districts, can apply to take part in that, although it is certainly not an easy lift. I think I'll go on to my next section because it's very brief, and then we'll go back to Sarah, if that's okay. Questions so far on what currently exists before I get to what the legislature is considering?
You're doing a great job. Just a quick check. Jack, were you able to get in touch with Susan? You're on mute.
Thank you. It wouldn't be a WebEx call if I didn't forget to take myself off mute. Sarah is with us now, and she should be ready to present. I believe I saw her her square pop up.
Okay, great. Thank you. Amy, why don't you go ahead and wrap up that last section, and then we'll go back to Ms. Williams.
Happy to. There is a potential legislative change, and Jack, you probably know the status of this bill better than I do. I've been waiting for session to formally wrap up, and then we'll work together to figure out what needs to go through state board rules and policies. But there is a bill that would expand the eligibility for individuals who are seeking to obtain that practitioner occupational license, that first one you get, to individuals who have relevant work experience in 3 of the last 5 years, as opposed to the current rule that talks about 5 years out of the last 10. It also states that the individual would not necessarily have to be enrolled in a job-embedded EdPrep program when they are earning the license initially, if they can provide proof that they are paired with a highly effective mentor teacher and that they have completed coursework in several specific areas. Those are classroom management, pedagogy, how to support students with disabilities and English learners, and the teacher code of ethics. And they would need to be doing that coursework from an approved EPP. That would be to get them in the door and get the practitioner license that then lasts for 3 years. In order to advance the license, they would have to meet all of those advancement criteria I talked about previously, including completing a job-embedded EdPrep provider. So they would not necessarily have to be enrolled on the front end if maybe they'd taken some of this coursework, but they would have to enroll and complete before they could advance their license. I believe there's even a second bill. Jack, you just mentioned this to me this morning that's related to occupational educators, but I am not sure where it is at the moment, so I hesitate to speak further unless you have an idea.
It is actually the same bill.
Okay.
I will spare folks the nuances around Robert's Rules of Order that allowed this to be reconsidered at this point in session. But you know, I think given how fluid it is, I'll refrain from speaking about specifics. But I will say this emphasizes the fact that not only are board members interested in this issue, obviously with the convening of this first committee, but the legislature is as well. There are active conversations in the General Assembly about just making sure we walk the correct fine line between having a sensible on-ramp for occupational teachers and recognizing the professional experiences they bring to the table, but also recognizing that teaching a classroom of 14-year-olds requires some training that your technical college or your job might not have given you. So I think that within that, there's questions about industry certification, which Sarah and Eric on our team will get into. But Amy is correct. They're still, even in the 9th hour of session, looking at this specific bill, or at least were earlier today.
And that's something that, as I said, when we see what ultimately passes in this legislative session, that's something you can expect to see in a workshop at the May board meeting, as Nathan always does a legislative wrap up. And then the team works with the Department of Ed to figure out how to promulgate rules and policies to come into compliance with the new laws. So as Jack said, it's an indicator that there's a great deal of interest in this topic and how very timely it is. Are there any questions for me? And I think this setup works just as well, because now you have a basis of how does someone get one of these licenses? And then Sarah can talk to us about what are they actually doing in the classroom once they have the license.
Amy, one question for maybe not directed at you per se, but the broader team would be, do we have any data to indicate how many of these pathways are being followed? In other words, if we take the full pool of all the occupational educators, how many have fallen path, A versus B versus C versus D? Is there someone that we could ask to chase that information down for us?
I think I'm going to look at Eric because this would be something coming out of TN Compass. Is that something we have access to?
To a certain extent, yes. There are certain aspects of the data system that allow us to pull data really easily, and then there are other more nuanced questions that's a little bit harder to answer. But while I don't have the statistics right off the top of my head, I can say with great confidence that the vast majority of occupational educators are coming through the in-state pathway. While we do have some out-of-state educators, it's a handful. It's definitely not a significant portion of the occupational educators entering our, well, I'd say workforce, but that's just who are issued a Tennessee license. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually teaching in Tennessee, just because they were issued the license.
I think that's important to keep in mind when we know how complicated all of these out-of-state pathways get, that it's important to account for individuals who are in those situations, but that our biggest lever, the place where we're getting most of our educators, is from Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. If it's okay with you, Eric, I'm going to follow up by email and just ask you to, when you get a chance, provide some insights on how the pie is sliced.
Sure, happy to do it.
Hey, Jordan, this is Bob Eby. One other thing that might be helpful is if we saw a graph or something that showed the increase over the last few years as we've offered these alternative pathways, how many are in, is that in fact a way that's growing, and at what rate it's growing at?
That's a great suggestion. I'll make a note of that, Bob, and we'll follow up with Eric. Thank you.
Well, Elizabeth alerted me to the fact that WebEx decided to give itself an upgrade, which is why we were not able to advance the slides as per usual. So Elizabeth, are you able to take us back to that slide where Sarah would begin presenting? I believe it should be slide 4.
You might have to bear with me for a second.
Okay. Apparently now we're in an event called a webinar where it used to be an event. So that's a fun surprise.
While we're waiting, I'll point out too that our licensure team, and Eric can speak to this further, I think has also been thoughtful about ensuring that there are sensible pathways for someone who already has a regular academic license, should they want to transition to an occupational space, or at least get to have the ability to teach a couple sections of an occupational course, that those pathways exist too, and that we're not potentially asking someone to go all the way back and begin their whole preparation process again if they've already got their academic license and have gone through some of the classes that have given them the pedagogical training on differentiating learning for unique learners, that sort of thing. Just wanted to flag that we're very mindful of that too. And you guys will see the shortage data that we collect at some point, I think, in the future, probably at this May workshop. But when it comes to shortages in specific subject areas, and occupational licensure included, any little amount of flexibility we can provide that even maybe makes it easier for a couple directors to staff a couple more teachers is going to be really, really helpful. So, the board really does have, through all of these licensure rules, the purview to, do good work in this space in a way that'll be impactful. And you'll see those rule revisions coming at the May meeting.
Thank you, Jack.
That's a great addition. And Sarah, thank you so much. I know we were ahead in our agenda. We're really happy to have you join us. As you might have inferred, we've been having some WebEx challenges, so I'm happy to advance the slides for you if you just give me a little verbal nudge.
Sure, thank you. Amy, I appreciate the patience. I had a little technology problem getting into the meeting, so but happy to have been invited and to be able to spend some time with you guys this afternoon, just kind of peeling back all of the later layers and getting down to what does it really mean to be an occupational licensure, and just to kind of establish some foundational context, I think, for these ongoing conversations. As we all know, the budget has passed that's going to impact our CTE space and the role of these educators, impact on communities at large. And so I'm really, really excited to join you. So we'll just kind of start out. Amy, if we go to the next slide, about what does it mean to be an educator in this space? And I'm a visual person. I have kind of a marketing background, so it's how you gain your content knowledge that really makes the difference between being considered an academic or an occupationally licensed educator. And so it's where that content knowledge comes from, and then you layer on top of that the pedagogical training that we've kind of talked through with some of these other opportunities for interested educators to find their way into a classroom. But then ultimately, once you are a licensed, endorsed educator, you fall into this same kind of circle, whether you be occupational or academically licensed. The expectations of those educators are the same across the board. As Jack and I have talked a few different times, occupational teachers walk into the same school as academic teachers. They sit next to each other during professional development and district learning days. They eat lunch together. They serve the same students. And work as a collaborative unit to help make those students prepare for whatever is going to come available to them, or opportunities that they want to seek post high school. Amy, if we go to the next slide. So kind of focusing in on that one bubble that is a little bit different from academic licenses and makes the occupational license category. What you see on the screen here, all of the different areas in which we offer an endorsement to be an occupational teacher. So everything from automotive, which we're going to focus on a little bit here in the next couple of slides, to barbering, cosmetology, to electrical, to information technology, plumbing, public health, supply chain management. So we're hitting a bunch of different topic areas. And these endorsements that an educator has on their licenses then allows them to teach the various courses within the CTE programs of study. So if you'll go, we're going to dive into the automotive area. That seems to be one that, as we're listening to CTE directors and districts across the state, automotive is one of those hard to fill positions. They can make a lot more money outside of a school system using their skills and their knowledge in the content. And so just wanted to highlight them, this particular endorsement. So as you can see on the screen here, this is pulled from our kind of guidance document. It's previously lived outside of the academic endorsement guidance documents, but as Eric will mention, we are marrying those all together and really making a concerted effort to make it easy for districts to get all of their endorsement information in one location. But to be endorsed with 770, which is our automotive space, you've got to at least have a high school diploma, got that work experience, and it's an A, B, or C. So potential educators don't have to meet all three of those work experience pieces, but one of the three. And then we have some sample qualifying experiences of what that could be: auto body technician, automotive technician, mechanic, or service technician. And we work very closely with Eric and her team as potential educators who are seeking their endorsements to work through what this experience could look like. So just because it's not listed on this graph doesn't mean we wouldn't accept the qualifying experience. We rely on our program managers who we consider our content experts to help guide if there's a unique or not common work experience out there for a potential educator. But then we also require an industry certification for that potential educator. The purpose of the industry credential or industry certification, those are kind of interchangeable words, is to provide the governing body, the licensing group, TDOE as a whole, and also the district, the confidence that the potential educator has valid content knowledge and experience. And one thing that we'll hear a lot is that this person is coming from the field. They've been in the field for 30 years, and now they want to maybe get out of the corporate space, get out of the schedule that they were on, or for whatever reason they want to enter into the classroom. And so why do they have to have a certification. And the certification just simply validates that content understanding. It makes sure that the educators that we're putting in front of our students are up to date, not only with perhaps technology that's in that field, also safety requirements, and then just that baseline content knowledge. And so for this particular endorsement, again, each endorsement has a different set, a different number of potential certification pieces that are required. But for this particular endorsement, you've got two different options. You can do kind of a suite of the initial level of the ASE or Automotive Service Excellence credentials. And you can see those listed there. We've got suspension and steering, brakes, electric system, and then engine performance. Or you could do one of the general ASE credentials, being that general automotive and maintenance and light repair. That we've kind of pulled the definition for you there from the ASE website of that's just that general ability to maintain and do minor or light repairs to your vehicles. And so this is everything from braking systems to rotating tires to changing oil, to checking the electrical systems of the car. That's becoming, in this industry as Ford is coming to join us, all things around batteries and general vehicle maintenance. And I say all of that to say, and Amy, if you want to head to the next slide.
Can I jump in really quick,
Sure.
just because I think it's fascinating, Sarah? We deal at such a high level at the board with the rules and policies, and I should have mentioned a little bit more in my slides. I said you have to have 5 years of work experience within 10 years, should have emphasized or equivalent education as defined by the department, and you can see Sarah here has defined what that would look like for this specific endorsement area. Just fascinating to see like the level of depth and detail that they have to go to in guidance, and then make sure as people apply for their licenses that they're ticking the right amount of boxes for each of these different endorsement areas. I just know from the board perspective, this isn't something that we get into all the time, just in a rule or policy. So I will hush and advance the slides.
No, that's fine. I'm an old teacher, so I'm happy to pause at any time. We're a very collaborative space here. But these next couple of slides kind of break down why is that industry credential important. We can go through the general terms of making sure that that potential educator, that their knowledge that they've gained while being out in the field, being an active professional in that field, it's just a validation process of that content knowledge. It's a way to objectively be able to say that this individual does have deep content knowledge that is going to be relevant to the students that they're going to be entrusted to teach, and honestly help prepare to take those same credentials at the end of their program of study, whether that be 3 or 4 courses within the content area. So kind of keeping with our automotive folks, we have here on this screen and the following screen just kind of a brief outline of what's covered in each one of the courses. So in that introductory course of MLR1, you can see we're just kind of setting the stage for that learner to kind of get a good idea. They do start preparing vehicles for service, so they do tire rotations in this course. And so students are, even at that first level course, lifting cars up on the car lifts, being underneath cars. So I cannot emphasize enough the safety aspect that falls into the occupational area that's a little unique from the academic area, because our students are hands-on, underneath, inside, with welding torches, doing the work, often from that first level course, which could be freshmen or sophomores. And so just to kind of call out the alignment per course, I'm not going to read each one of these slides to you, but just to kind of digest and bring through why those credentials are important. As you see here, if you're doing the suite of those specific ASE certifications instead of the general, you touch on 2 of the 4 in maintenance and light repair 1. You hit the 3rd in maintenance and light repair 2. I apologize for the typo here, but the right column are kind of the buckets, content buckets for the maintenance and light repair course 2. And then Amy, if you'll go to the next, then we go into maintenance and light repair 3. We come back and focus back in on 2 of the 3 pieces that we've already discussed. And then in that 4th course, that typically senior level capstone course, they hit that 4th area of that engine performance. So again, just kind of wanting to highlight I'm always happy to share what we are hoping students learn throughout our CTE programs of study, but really wanting to draw a strong connection between what's being taught to students and what we're asking potential educators to have validated that they have the content knowledge, that those two things have a strong connection. And so we're not asking just to validate that you have any type of content knowledge, but that your content knowledge is matching up with what industry post-secondary are telling us should be taught to high school students. And so there is kind of this full circle piece of preparing students with prepared educators.
Ms. Williams, just a quick question for you. You mentioned putting a car up on lifts as an example. Can you give us just some sense of how many of these courses are taught in a classroom, on the school grounds versus offsite in some form? Do you have just a rough estimate of the percentages of the breakdown?
So I would say every class has a classroom component. Every single course, every single teacher has a classroom setting where they'll go over those kind of textbook pieces where it's learning through maybe modules or exploring the jargon of the industry in those introductory courses, to practicing. Before then, they demonstrate those skills and explore those skills in often a connected shop. And so the shop is just an exploratory classroom, a hands-on classroom environment. And so I'd say 100% have that classroom, school desk, textbook component. But then they also get pulled out. We like to say for as much time as possible to be hands-on and exploring that learning, but we know that we can't just send students off to the shop without any contextual kind of expectation setting, not only for safety reasons, but also to have an understanding of what they're going in this particular content. If they're looking at the engine, they'll have an engine lesson within a classroom setting where the teacher is breaking down what the engine parts look like, how they go together, how they work together, and then might move into the shop to look at a community member's car that's been brought in that has some engine related pieces. And so that shop piece is the reinforcement and the display of learning, but there's always a classroom component. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Amy, you were going to ask your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Sarah, how often are these industry credentials reviewed to make sure it's the right one for each program of study area? I know it's something you do with some frequency, but could you talk about that process a bit?
Sure, absolutely. So we've been working as we've kind of transitioned licensure from being under CTE back to Educator licensure for consistency across all licenses. Kind of been doing a general update across all endorsement areas that was concluded this past fall with the release of our new guidance document, again, as mentioned before, folding in with all other endorsement area documents. Moving forward, we will evaluate the credentials on two different rotations. One, as part of our career cluster comprehensive review, which a career cluster undergoes that review once every 3 years. This review is also what drives any content changes that we end up bringing back to you as a board in July and November each year. We bring essentially a third of our courses up for revision. So the review for the potential educator licensure requirements would be folded in to that annual review. So a third would get reviewed every year. And then as we have ongoing conversations and collaboration with Eric and her team, if a case is brought that a potential certification should be considered outside of that cycle time, we'll review that at that time for that educator. And then if we deem that it is an okay credential or certification that is in alignment with the course standards, is in alignment with that validation of that potential educator's content knowledge, if we make an exception for one teacher, we will then be making an exception for all teachers. So that would then get automatically folded into this guidance document. So a formal review every 3 years, but with the caveat of kind of an ongoing review as needed, floating underneath. Does that answer your question, Amy?
Thank you. Yes.
May I,
Sure.
may I follow up on that?
Please.
What drives the course content? And I'm thinking, looking at this automotive, and obviously, in the past, it's all been gasoline engines, and now with hybrid and electrical engines. Is it the industry and being able to provide the facilities, or is it the board is setting the standards, or what drives the change then that would eventually maybe bring in hybrid or electrical in a course like this?
Sure. Automotive is actually a fair one to start with, because you'll be seeing the automotive course standard revisions in July. They are coming out of our career cluster review process. But what we do when we're looking at courses is ultimately our goal is to have students prepared to enter in the workforce, or to continue in this study, whether that be through job embedded training, whether that be through post-secondary training, whatever the opportunities lie. And so for us to be able to have confidence that our standards are leading students down those opportunities, we consult every year with an advisory council that has members from post-secondary institutions, both 4-year and 2-year, as well as various industry partners. Try to get a good sampling of large and small in that industry space, as well as urban, suburban, and then within each one of the grand divisions of the state, because we know, with Ford coming in West Tennessee, that's really impacting a lot of what is driving the changes that you'll see in July, is building out that battery piece. And there've been a lot of conversations, both along with Ford and along with some of our friends at TCAT, around what is an appropriate, definitely around safety with the voltage that comes with these batteries, what's appropriate in a high school setting versus what should get started, and where students should dig in within the TCAT programs of study. So we're always looking for that kind of seamless alignment for a student to leave the K-12 system and continue their study, and to appropriately assign that rigor to that student, whether it be within terms of safety. If we were looking at health science, we don't let high school students draw blood. We just don't feel like that's a safe place for them to explore that learning. We'll let that happen whenever they are outside of the public school system, and continuing their education. And so as we review our content, it's always alongside our partners, post-secondary as well as industry, with industry really driving where are those innovative topics and emerging technologies that we need to start, whether it's even just at an awareness level in the or in the secondary curriculum and standards, or if it's more hands-on kind of partnerships to get equipment, and make those recommendations back to districts, so that what we're suggesting districts are able to have in place in the local classrooms and shops of the students. Sorry, I'm really passionate about this topic, so I don't want to go over my time, but I want to answer all the questions. I think this may be my last slide, and I just want to highlight here. This all comes. The source document for this comes from the Vision of Excellent CTE Instruction. And so when we're looking at what we say as the Department of Education that we expect from CTE classrooms, the educator and the student expectations that you see on this slide are very similar to what would be accepted in any classroom, or the expectations set in any classroom. And that the educator has classroom goals and expectations that are clear and set forth for the student and parents, that ensure those safe environment industry standards for safety in our world. Occupational educators are doing a curriculum map. They're breaking down the course content and standards in a progression that is logical for the student to walk through, and setting those daily objectives for students. Occupational educators are doing lesson plans on a regular and daily basis. They submit those lesson plans along with all other educators in their school based upon their district or school expectations and requirements. And then they're assessing the student learning, whether that be in a classroom setting, in a shop setting, or through industry credentials, some combination of that, along with dual enrollment and all of the other really exciting opportunities that students have in CTE. They are doing that full loop from planning and setting the goals and expectations to assessing their students' attainment towards those goals and expectations. And of course, we expect our students to participate daily, to take advantage of all of the different opportunities. And we do expect our students, CTE students, to view themselves as the professional in their fields. They are growing and emerging leaders in their area. And so we want those expectations to settle in strong with them from level 1 courses on. And so I hope you see here that an occupational classroom versus a non-occupational classroom are very similar. It's just the content in which that's discussed inside those walls and inside that class period that may look a little bit different, and how the educator became an expert in that content often also looks different. So with that, open it up for questions. Happy to answer anything you have.
I'll start. Ms. Williams, I really appreciate your passion. I can tell that you're very excited, and that's fantastic. I view this as a field in which, yes, it's a part of education, but it's also very much a part of inspiring hope and opportunity for students that may not otherwise have this kind of opportunity naturally come their way. So the work that you're doing is extremely important. It impacts lives in big ways. First question is, are there any states, and I'm just going to be very candid, are there other states that you look at and say, man, I wish we could be more like that? Are there other models that we can learn from?
I never want to say no to this question, but in Tennessee, and by birth and by choice, I mean this with as much humility and grace, hopefully, as possible. But Tennessee's just on the leading edge when it comes to CTE. Whenever I'm always talking to others in Colorado or California. We look to Indiana sometimes for different aspects. But when you look at the whole of CTE, when we get together as state CTE leaders, I always want to walk away with some kind of content knowledge, but I very rarely look at a whole picture and think, man, we've really got to make some gains in this area. And I say that as deep appreciation for the board, for our legislative bodies, for governors and commissioners who have really supported these efforts. So yes and no. Yes, we always look to be better, but sometimes it's hard to find it among our peers because our state is just accelerated beyond where most are.
If I could also add, just from the licensure perspective, when we're looking at licenses from other states and determining reciprocity for occupational educators, we see a really narrow band of occupational endorsements from other states. And so I'm not sure, since I'm not a CTE expert, if that's because we really offer a lot more diverse occupational endorsement areas and programming, but I certainly get that impression from the credentialing side. So I thought it might be worth adding.
Yeah, thanks, Eric.
So Ms. Williams, let me follow up that question with another one. And first of all, again, really appreciate the work you're doing. It's fantastic that we're on that leading edge, but I think we would all agree that we can do more, and we want to find the paths or the dots to connect to do more. So with that in mind, what do you view as the biggest challenge? What's the biggest type of challenge that you're hearing from educators in the field? Is it lack of facilities? Is it lack of student interest? Is it lack of occupational educators? If you had to rank order those, what would be the one that's most on your mind?
I'd say there are two that are equally tied, and a little bit of a chicken and an egg, and that being having the space. We've got a lot of districts who want to offer more and different programs of study to meet their local labor market needs. And they can have all of the money in the world for equipment, which is what Perkins, I don't want to go too far, but Perkins can allow you to buy equipment, but it can't allow you for capital investment. And so you can buy all the equipment that you want, but you don't have anywhere to put it. You don't have anywhere to put it. And so the program never comes to be. So I think that we hear that often. I would say equally as often we hear that there is an educator or a potential educator who's interested in teaching the courses. They have extensive years of service within the industry, but becoming an occupational licensed educator can sometimes be a confusing and or daunting process because there is, I think, a misconception out there that, well, I've been in the field and I've excelled in my field. Even I can have credentials all over the place that say I'm an expert in my field. So therefore, I should be an expert in the classroom as well. And I think we all know that there is an art of teaching as well as that technical knowledge of what we are teaching. And so having folks kind of step back and make sure that they have an understanding of classroom management, of learning with diverse students, with teaching within a public school system, having that learning takes, I think, a particular type of potential educator candidate to be willing to say, I've got my content knowledge, pass these licensures and whatnot with full force, but understanding how to work with 20 to 25 students in a shop environment. It's different than when you're in the professional field. Our program manager, John Mummert, who is over construction, architecture, transportation, he was like, you know, when he's working with new educators, he's like, you have to talk to students differently than how you would talk to your coworkers on the job site. And you have to approach those learning opportunities, if you're a manager at a job site, differently than those learning opportunities with students who are at the foundational base, not just because of the age and experience difference, but just because of the physiological differences of the brain hasn't completely formed. And sometimes high school students just make different decisions than adults would make. And so I think sometimes making that transition is harder on occupational educators than we give necessarily credit for. And so they may enter into the classroom with great hope and great content knowledge, but the retention of educators in that space is, I think, something that districts definitely struggle with across all content areas, and especially across all occupational areas. So space, and then recruitment and retention both for the educator in the classroom.
Thank you. I'm going to do a time check real quick. Amy, do we have Mr. Wilson or Dr. Wilson dialed in already?
We do, yes.
Okay.
And I would also just note, if we have just a real quick follow-up to what Sarah was saying, as many of you know, I was a social studies teacher, and those things down the educator expectations column would have looked just the same for me and were some of the things that I learned in ed prep. And then the difference, of course, the skills specific to the industry would be thinking like a historian, analytical writing, those content area skills, but some of those things about unit planning, lesson planning, breaking down the year into manageable chunks, working with diverse students, it looks really, really similar. So I think that's a great point she made.
Thank you, Amy. Bob, did you have a question before we move on?
One more, and maybe it's one that Dr. Wilson will answer. The question is how has CTE classes grown number-wise over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, and how much impact did the pandemic have, since a lot of the CTE classes are hands-on and can't be taught virtually? And I'd say maybe that's for the next speaker too. So.
Sure, I think Dr. Wilson will have some definitely hands-on, school-specific, teacher-specific responses to that. I think I can pull some data, but our our enrollment in CTE courses continues to grow. It's been kind of on an upward trajectory for a number of years, but I'd be happy to follow up with kind of a visualized version of that, very similar to the pathway conversation earlier. And then the pandemic was hard on our areas because it is very hands-on learning. And so while our staff was attempting to help to give some lessons that can be taught at home, and how can you pull together, and again, I'll keep coming back to safety, but how can you pull together and demonstrate knowledge of an engine system without opening up the hood of your parents' car and without any supervision of getting to work there. Trying to be as creative as we can. I think there was a lot of reliance and honestly an opening of virtual resources of being able to take where to find all sorts of YouTube videos on how to change your oil. So you can get that baseline knowledge started, But then I think teachers videoing what they were doing in their shop by themselves was a way to kind of bridge that gap when everybody wasn't always in the classroom. And I think some of that has turned into some instructional methods that have shifted, which I'm sure Dr. Wilson can talk more about. But I think we've opened up our minds a little bit about what can that instruction look like in a way that can meet those diverse learners. Because for as much as instruction may have had to change because of the pandemic, our learners have definitely changed because of the pandemic as well, and how they want and prefer to learn.
Thank you. I think that data would be helpful to the board members.
Sure. Well, happy to.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Are you going to be around for the rest of the session, Ms. Williams?
I will.
Okay, great. I have a couple more questions, but I want to make sure that we give everybody time to get through their presentations. Amy, can you, I believe we have Ms. Olmstead next.
Yes, we have just a few slides. We asked Eric to join us from the Office of Educator, Licensure, and Prep. So we've now seen what are the rules and policies about getting a license. What do you do once you're in the classroom? This is sort of the bridge of how does someone actually apply for an occupational educator license? How do districts know how to support people in getting licensed, and what are maybe some issues they've run into along the way? So Eric, you can take it away. And again, if you'd like to just give me a verbal cue, I'm happy to advance the slides.
Terrific. Thanks, Amy. So I'm Eric Olmstead, Director of Licensure and Operations at the department. And for those of you that I haven't had the pleasure to interact with directly, either recently or at all, given the pandemic and that we've all been virtual for some time, I supervise the team of 9 personnel in the Office of Educator Licensure who are responsible for the processing of educator license transactions in our TN Compass educator management system. We have a program manager, 3 senior licensure analysts, 2 senior licensure analysts, and a half a dozen licensure analysts who process transactions. So their full-time equivalency is dedicated to processing and to answering questions to both educators, districts, educator candidates, educator preparation providers regarding the various processes and requirements around licensure. As Sarah had alluded to in her previous presentation, our team picked up the occupational licensure processing piece back a few years ago that used to live with the CTE team. And it didn't seem right to us to treat occupational educators different than any other professional educator. And so that we needed to bring our processes into alignment to make sure that we were giving just as much attention to the occupational piece and to ensuring that occupational standards are being met for educators entering the occupational workforce. I'm going to try not to say occupational 100 more times if I can help it. So just a little bit of background about how our office goes about issuing occupational licenses. We have the primary resource that Sarah talked about earlier and showed an excerpt from, which is the Occupational Licensure and Endorsement Guidance document that breaks down each of the different endorsement areas in the occupational suite of endorsements by the different experience and education requirements and industry certification requirements. That document is accessible by districts, educator candidates, and our office to be able to review in one place on our website. That document that's been updated recently collaboratively between our 2 teams to hopefully have some additional resources, information, links to frequently accessed websites is now on a 1-year review rotation for any additional updates, along with our educator licensure operating procedures for districts guidance document, where we are rolling the occupational guidance into our broader department guidance for districts to follow as it relates to personnel and licensure more broadly. So kind of a one-stop shop for licensure resources. So the first step in the process is that a candidate typically communicates with the district about a vacancy, and the district will do kind of a preliminary review to see if their credentials look like they align, their work experiences, their industry certification, et cetera, with the requirements that are in that licensure and endorsement guidance document. Then the individual will submit a CTE request in TN Compass. And this is sort of a pre-approval process. So they may or may not have reached out to an educator preparation provider at this point. If they have, they'll indicate which educator preparation provider they're planning to work with. They'll provide a notarized copy of the occupational work experience and qualification form. This is a document that summarizes all in one place the various work experience and the timeframes of employment that a potential occupational educator may have completed in their history. It also summarizes their educational attainment. So we have just kind of one place to look over all of the different qualifications and make a determination about if that educator meets the requirements to then enroll in an educator preparation program. with job embedded clinical practice, as all of the programs that are approved for licensure in Tennessee for occupational allow educators to serve as a teacher of record while they're completing their occupational preparation. This is also the point where we would review for a valid industry certification. Now, our licensure analysts, they are trained in following policies and rules, but they don't have deep subject matter expertise in the occupational subject areas. And so they're looking for close or exact alignment to the document, which means that lots of times we get candidates who apply and either their work experience doesn't quite, in terms of the terminology, line up, or their industry certification may be close, but not quite what we're looking for. And so we work really closely with the CTE team, with Sarah's team, to connect with the content coordinators over each area whenever something doesn't align perfectly, to determine, is this an area of work experience that should be included in our guidance document? Or is this an industry certification that we really should be accepting because it does align with the courses of, or the programs of study and the courses that somebody with that endorsement will be entitled to teach? And sometimes we determine that there is something that was overlooked, and we collaboratively, add it to our guidance document, because we certainly don't want to create scenarios in which we're accepting a particular credential or work experience for one person and not for everyone. So we also use that as an opportunity to kind of ad hoc look at our overall requirements. If the documentation is missing anything, we'll mark it deficient. It's an iterative process, and the educator candidate can resubmit that for review by the department. If it is approved, then it basically creates a transaction in TN Compass that the educator preparation provider, where that individual is enrolling, can then submit for actual licensure issuance once the pre-approval has been completed. I'm going to just pause for if there are any questions on this slide before we advance.
Hey, Eric, I just have a quick question. Do you have any data on how many people begin this process? In other words, they meet the requirements for the minimum education, the experience, and the industry certification, but they ultimately don't succeed in obtaining their I guess they're not the professional designation, but the practitioner designation. Do you have any sense of how many people self-select out of that process?
I don't. That's not something that we've looked at systematically, and it would be a report that would need to be built in the system to produce. I would say that it's certainly the number of folks who do end up applying for a license is pretty high in the cases where it's a district EPP. So the employer and the educator preparation provider are the same entity, because that person's already pretty embedded. They have all their resources in one place. Also, those are newer programs that are, very motivated as both the employer and the educator preparation provider to ensure continuity there. But I don't actually know in terms of data. That would be something that we would have to dig into down the road.
Okay, and just, I guess, short of having to create a custom report, do you have just anecdotally a sense of what that might be? Do you think it's a 95% success rate, or is it a 20%
I think it's pretty high, and I think that that's because the vast majority of folks who are applying through this pathway already have a job lined up. So just anecdotally, I feel like the vast majority of them, if they're making it through getting an approved CTE request, they're already just waiting to start work and get involved with their educator preparation providers programming.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
I would agree with that anecdotally. We've not seen a large number, even before establishing our own EPP, we've not seen a large number of people that have, I guess, stopped working for Knox County Schools by virtue of the fact that they didn't finish their EPP program. They're generally pretty successful at following through with that once they started. And to Eric's point, because sort of the job and the enrollment go hand in hand, one has to kind of coincide with the other. I think people generally, once they know what they're signing up for, they tend to follow through on it.
Okay, next slide, unless there are more questions.
Proceed.
Okay, so the next step, as I said, once the CTE request is approved, the educator preparation provider submits the application for licensure in TN Compass, and then the district has the option of marking that application as high priority. So I just want to speak a little bit to the timelines here. Barring some staffing shortages that we had back last year, we had almost 30% turnover in our office, and we got very behind during the already very busy summer and fall months. Now that we're fully staffed, we're turning around the initial CTE request that pre-approval transaction within about a week of submission. And then when districts mark applications as high priority in T-Encompass, the actual licensure transaction, we're generally able to process that transaction, if not same day, then usually next business day. So districts should be able to get a pretty quick answer regarding eligibility for these occupational candidates because of that high priority transaction option in T-Encompass. Educators through this in-state pathway, and I know earlier Amy spoke to the out-of-state pathways, all of this is just about in-state initial licensure issuance. They receive the practitioner first issuance license, which is a 3-year license. Then they have that time period to meet the requirements of completing a program and any required assessments, which in most occupational areas, that's just the principles of learning and teaching, which is the pedagogical assessment. You may be familiar with the EdTPA. That's not required for occupational candidates, given that the EdTPA has a bit of a content focus because it's a performative assessment. So educators are delivering a lesson in a content area, and there just aren't handbooks for the EdTPA for occupational licensure. So we have the option of the Principles of Learning and Teaching Praxis Assessment for measuring pedagogical knowledge. So that needs to be completed at the end of the 3 years for the educator to be able to renew. They can be issued a practitioner's second issuance license. So that gives them another 3 years to meet the advancement requirements to advance the professional license if those requirements aren't met within the validity period of the first issuance license. So to advance, they need to have 30 professional development points, which are easily obtained through the occupational new teacher training that all early career occupational educators complete usually in their first year of teaching, and through district in-service requirements. And then they also need to have 3 years of teaching experience to advance that license. So they get 6 years to meet those advancement requirements. They also need to maintain their industry certification for renewal and advancement to show that they're staying current with the standards of their industry. I'll also just add that educators can apply to advance whenever advancement criteria are met. We have renewal windows that open for a license to be renewed. That's just the year prior to expiration, but advancement is an open option as soon as criteria are met. So if somebody just plows through their educator preparation program, gets all their assessments done, and they start working, right away when their license is issued, they could advance, right at the end of that first 3 years. They don't necessarily have to go to the practitioner's second issuance license. They can go to the professional fairly quickly. Any questions about the licensure process?
You're doing a great job, Eric. Please continue.
My pleasure. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of cross-team collaboration. I think that I hope that Sarah would agree that the licensure team and the CTE team have the strongest relationship that we've probably ever had under her leadership. I am in regular communication with the content experts on her team. I'm usually in communication with at least one of them almost daily. They're extremely responsive. We're able to talk through licensure requirements, the nuances of different industry certifications and work experience. And we're able to kind of collaborate very quickly and in the moment when we have an applicant in front of us that we need to make a decision about. So I'm incredibly grateful for Sarah's leadership and for that collaboration, because previously we didn't have a lot of understanding about occupational licensure because it didn't live on our team. So it's taken me some time to really get up to speed. As you can tell, particularly from Sarah's presentation, there's a lot to unpack around occupational licensure. It's a very complex field with a lot of nuance and a lot of rich, diverse content area specialties inside of it. So every year, we're collaboratively reviewing and updating that licensure and endorsement guidance document, as well as doing ad hoc reviews as particular candidates pose, different options for work experience and certifications to us. And we also collaborate with that team to help bring policy recommendations to the board around occupational licensure. For example, if CTE identifies areas of endorsement that need to be created, whether that's based on, district needs or industry needs, we then help to propose that to the board. We'll be bringing a couple of endorsements in the occupational area to the board next time around at the board meeting. So those are just some of the ways that we're working together to continue to bridge the gaps between operationalizing licensure policy and rule and bringing that into the classroom and making those connections for educators. I think this is my last slide. Is that true? Okay.
the head nod from Amy. Eric, great job. Are you going to be able to stick with us for the remainder of the presentation today?
Absolutely, it's my pleasure.
Okay, great. So we'll, I'm sure there'll be some questions at the end. Dr. Wilson, thank you for joining us. You weren't here when we opened up the session, but I just want to emphasize we appreciate your attendance. And then also I want to emphasize that our goal today is to cover as much material as quickly as we can. So please talk fast and motor through the slides, and we'll have some Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Take it away. I'll continue to advance for you. Just let me know.
All right, I have clickers here. I don't know if they're working or not, but it appears
Oh, by
to
all means, give them a shot.
All right. So yeah, just trying to provide you guys with some district perspective. Let me say first, I mean, we've been on calls with Eric this past week, even talking through a couple of issues that we have. And so we do get lots of support, both from Sarah's team of folks, as well as the licensure office. And I'll talk a little bit about our EPP. That's been a new chapter that has, I won't say it's complicated matters, but it's given us a new appreciation for, you know, onboarding candidates and trying to understand and deal in all the nuance of the different endorsements and, you know, beyond just sort of trying to hire teachers, but also think through the communication and the requirements of those candidates have to meet, and that can be a little challenging. So I really thought, just in terms of trying to talk to you guys from a district perspective, you know, as Sarah's talked about the quality of the candidate and the expectations and things like that, those are certainly high priorities for us. I'm an old middle grades science teacher by trade, and was very engaged and part of the team that initially started doing training when the teacher evaluation model team was rolled out. So, I mean, I have all the appreciation in the world for instructional quality and, you know, accountability in that area and all of that. And so all that's important to me too. And then I also feel the pain and the challenge of needing to hire and to fulfill the needs that schools have when they start to move in a direction and plan for programming and schedule students. And so it's always finding that balance, I think, for us in terms of, you know, finding the candidate that fits the bill and meets the need of the school, and then also adheres to the expectations and things that are there. And that can be very challenging to do. So first, just if you're not as familiar with Knox County, we're the third largest district in the state, serve about 60,000 students approximately. Apparently I don't have clicker rights, and have 91 total schools, counting our virtual campuses and everyone else. Within that, 15 traditional high schools, with, again, depending on the size of the school and the campus, a fairly robust CTE program across our district. That has grown some, I would say, over the past few years. I've been in the CTE director seat for 5 years, and I definitely have seen some, I would say, conservative expansion, but I think those expansion areas have been in places that we wanted to see growth, you know, especially in areas like STEM and engineering, and in areas like information technology. We still have a ton of occupational and trade type areas across the district, certainly, but a good diverse set of programs. You can see approximately 190 distinct programs of study across the county. So when you look at some of the things that are areas of endorsement and concentration that Sarah was sharing earlier, you know, we've got a wide range of programs across those 15 high schools that serve students from all kinds of interests and backgrounds. And I would say in the time that I have been here, we've been probably turning over, whether that's through resignation or retirement or the addition of programming, needing about 12 to 15 new CTE hires each year. We're just within our district. So when I'm talking about a few challenges, you know, the first is going to be kind of back to what I was saying with Sarah, that this idea of balancing that quality and quantity when we think about candidates and who we're looking for in terms of teachers. The onboarding process for new candidates is also a challenge, and you've already heard a lot about you know, really those expectations and what teachers are expected to engage in and be prepared for as soon as they start into this change in profession. Recruitment and retention, which Sarah mentioned earlier, is a big area of need across the state. And again, licensure, obviously that's what we're here to talk about too, is just, you know, those types of licenses and access to appropriate pathways. And again, we've done some things to try to help in these areas as well, which I'll highlight. So challenge one, I would say, where do these candidates come from, right? When we're thinking about where do we get these teachers, when I first started as the CTE director, I had a group of specialists that work in my department and serve sort of in similar roles to the Doxera staff. They serve certain programs and serve in support roles. And my question to them was, how do we ever find these people? Like who is coming to work at the school district, taking a cut in pay and wants to work with high school kids? I don't understand this, right? But miraculously, we just turn up with candidates that are interested in this, and has been relatively consistently, we've been able to fill the needs that we have had for the most part. So we have nurses, we have welders, we have maintenance technicians of different varieties, automotive or maybe industrial, and often it's people that are looking for a change of pace in the career that they've been in. Maybe it's a change of schedule. Folks that are working on an hourly wage that may be doing a lot of weekends and holidays and things like that, who've done 10, 15 years of maybe labor intensive, hands-on type work, looking for a way to lighten that load a little bit. Those are the types of folks often that we find expressing interest. Also retirees, so maybe folks that have served in a capacity for a long time and are looking for a way to continue to work, but maybe also give back and apply what they've been doing over time into the life of a student. And then, as we mentioned earlier too, about those options for adding on license, sometimes it's a traditional teacher who potentially has an experience or a skill set outside of their normal, teaching job that they can bring and will meet the requirement for adding on that occupational endorsement area, often in an area like information technology and teaching coding or something like that. We have teachers that will convert and do those sorts of things. Just like everything, it seems these days, we're often dealing with an issue of supply and demand when it comes to the candidates that we're looking for. I was talking this past week, as I said, with Eric about a couple of situations. And by and large, when we have time to plan, and I have a principal at a high school who in the spring of the year is telling me, hey, I've got this retirement coming up and I'm thinking about shifting a program in this direction, or maybe I'm going to keep that program and I need to hire a new candidate. When we have that sort of lead time, we really don't run into usually a lot of hiccups in terms of processing candidates and onboarding them and getting them ready to go. It's those unexpected openings, I think, is where we tend to have the biggest challenges. And again, talking with Eric earlier in the week, we had the situation at one of our campuses this past year at the midpoint, December to January, Christmas break. We had a change in a program that caused us to lose a TCAT program and need to add back a high school focused program. And then also a welding instructor who took a job with TCAT. And so we had to hire a welding instructor mid-year as well. And both of those situations, again, we've already got a high school schedule built. We've already got students signed up in the class. We've already got, so much happening at the school level that they're having to navigate with that. The timeliness and the ability to navigate that quickly and for us to find and secure a candidate can be challenging when we have those unexpected openings. And again, not a reflection on Eric or their process necessarily, just really there's a lot to do when you start to look at trying to make sure you have the right fit and hope that you can find the right fit on short notice by that way. Next slide, I'd say. So onboarding new candidates, and you've already heard a lot about this process. Again, we knew it because of just hiring practices in the past. As we've become our own EPP, it's become even more prevalent. But if you put yourself in the shoe of the said nurse or welder or whoever this is that's moving into this profession and has been working in a hospital or a shop or wherever they've been working, they're going to probably apply for a job that they're going to find online. They're going to meet with a principal who they probably haven't sat down with a principal since they were in high school themselves. They're going to interact with human resources from Knox County Schools. They're going to interact. Human resources is probably going to refer them to us to talk to us about licensure and those sorts of pieces, which they tend to not understand. We've talked about the complexity of occupational. They tend to refer them to us. They're going to need to get into the TN Compass platform and set up their credentials and access that. They're going to apply for a license. They're going to upload work histories that's notarized and any transcripts they have and all of those sorts of things. They're going to need to register with an educational preparation provider, which again, we've eased that route for them a little bit here in Knox County. But prior to that, that was, you know, with UT Martin, that was with East Tennessee State or Tennessee Tech. You know, those were the options for our candidates. They're going to have to make sure they have the industry credential that's appropriate, which the expectation for that has tightened up a bit in recent times. So all of that has happened for that person who is changing jobs and careers before they've ever met the first student, the first colleague at their school, before they've seen a standard or a curriculum potentially, before they've gone to their first teacher in service, attended a staff meeting. Like, they've navigated or had to navigate all of that. And so we see the deer in the headlights look a lot with candidates that, you know, again, want to come and want to do this work, but they very quickly learn the gravity of the move they're making when all of this stuff is sort of thrown at them. So it's a very hands-on process for us. That involves, as you see, all of the different folks referenced here. It involves a lot of people talking through and counseling and sort of helping them to orchestrate the moves they need to make in order to bring a candidate on to become a teacher. And then the third challenge is back to Sarah's earlier comment, and that is recruitment and retention. First, we're as a school district, I mean, we have room, I think, to improve on our recruitment of traditional teachers, but, you know, these candidates are very non-traditional by nature. So, you know, we're for years, we have had a big human resources, you know, career fair, and all these new graduates from UT and Carson Newman and everywhere else show up and they meet principals and they hand out resumes. And, you know, we know how many English teachers we're going to need and how many math teachers, all of that. But CTE doesn't typically work that way. And, you know, quite often, as I said, if we know in the spring we have a retirement or resignation, something like that, we can do more to recruit and to post positions and make sure people are aware of that. But, you know, again, we often find out in July that this teacher's not coming back, and we're looking and scrambling to try to find that replacement. So the unexpected certainly do provide a challenge. But the other side of that, it comes back into how you're forecasting for your programming. So, you know, that's an education piece for our principals as well, helping them to understand, you know, when you look at the CTE programs of study you offer, and you know, from a long range planning standpoint over the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you know, here are where your opportunities for change are. Maybe you have a retirement or resignation coming up, or, you know, you're going to get an additional staff position you could put towards a CTE program of study. Well, what does workforce demand tell us we need to be steering into? Where's a place we need to shift programming and think differently? Is there a subset of students in terms of their interests and aptitudes that we're not serving well, that we need to be thinking about a different program for your school? And so that's work that we're trying to do, and we're trying to really lift off now, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's to give our principals a better sense of direction when they're thinking about programming in their building, rather than no fault of their own. But, you know, historically, it's kind of been Miss Smith has taught this class for 15 years. She does the prom. She's an institution. There's no way we could not have this, you know, CTE program of study. And that's great. We love Miss Smith and we want to do right by her. But also at the end of the day, we're called to meet some certain standards when it comes to the programs we offer, and helping them to look further out than just kind of the incident that's in front of them or the circumstance that's in front of them, and to think smartly about how we're shifting those programs over time. And so again, there's some work we're doing on that as well. Obviously salaries, right? Competitive salaries. If you look at anything, I mean, nurses can travel now and make $170 an hour and crazy money like that. And, you know, automotive technicians, we have kids that have come out and as welders and gone to work for unions and made $80,000 and $90,000 within a year or two of graduating. And, you know, we're hiring teachers in at a max, kind of internal policy I have a problem with, a max of 5 years experience. And, you know, that's putting them in at about $44,000, $45,000. So again, it's a shorter work year, 200 days, and there's certainly some perks to benefits and schedule and things like that that we promote. But you know, the reality is we can't compete with what these folks can make working in industry, and so that becomes a retention issue sometimes, and it becomes a recruitment issue as well. And then the last thing, and you asked this question earlier about our teachers finishing their EPP and sticking with it, really, you know, to get through that. And I make an important point about recruitment and retention to say that we have worked even prior to the EPP, I think, really hard to support our new teachers as they've come on. We used to pay some out of our Perkins dollars. We would pay some stipends for some of our more experienced teachers to work in a mentoring capacity, to make some classroom visits and provide some just, you know, colleague coaching. Like, we've got a great staff within CTE that help with programming and things like that, but we're also not on the ground with students in classrooms every day. And so having that kind of colleague that's there, that can mentor, that can kind of show you the way, we've always done things like that to help onboard those new teachers. And so in shifting to the EPP, we've had some more structure around that, some more intensive, I guess, coaching and mentoring that have gone with that program. But that can also be part of the overwhelming piece too for these new teachers. So, you know, all those things that they're doing and learning and everything else, and then, you know, that support piece is one more thing sometimes that I have to do. So we have to be very careful about, I think, how we go about providing that support so that it is received that way, and that it feels like something that is taking off my plate, not adding to it. And that's been a little bit of lesson learned, I think, with our EPP this year. We had a start date in July for the new people who were starting their licensure program with us. And then we had some folks obviously hired later in the summer, August or so, before they got on board. And so we tried to go back and, you know, give them some opportunity to catch up and do some of the kind of outside of the classroom, do some of the coursework they needed to do to catch up. And we found that was a recipe for disaster, because they were already feeling behind right out of the gate. And then we just gave them, you know, we just gave them 40 hours more of work to go, hey, and when your spare time, make this up. So we won't be doing that this next year. We've learned some lessons on that as well. But yeah, I think there's definitely a balance there to not adding more to the plate as you are trying to help these folks transition. So just to highlight a couple of things that I do think we're doing that have spoken back into some of our challenges. As was already mentioned, we're the, I think, second district in the state to take on providing our own educator preparation provider, specifically aimed currently at occupational licensed teachers. And so based on board approval and everything, that started in 2021-22. This is our first year. And it is a 2-year program that we have worked with the Southern Regional Education Board, or SREB, and their Teach to Lead curriculum. That has been used in other places in the country and in the state as well to support teacher licensure in this area. And it is a basic, if you think about, if you were going through a traditional teacher training program like I did as a science teacher, it is the pedagogy side, it's the literacy, it's the special ed, but it also is framed to prepare teachers who are moving from industry to education. So it's definitely aimed at that population of educator. We got into this work, the state had received an EPIC grant that they had been able to use to really promote expansion of licensure and these pathways. And we got involved because there was a desire to create sort of a regional cohort of counties on the east side of the state. As I mentioned, the programs that were available for our teachers to complete occupational licensure weren't necessarily local for our folks. And that was kind of, LMU had an occupational licensure program prior to some reorganization by the state to I think up the standards a bit for these programs, and LMU made the decision to not continue that. So that created a bit of a gap in the East region here for programs for those teachers. And so what came out of the desire to have a cohort of districts come together was we actually were able to accept the grant, and we launched a regional EPP model. So we are serving actually districts from primarily the East region. Hamlin County has been participating with us mainly because we like Chuck Carter. But other than that, we would be willing to entertain folks that are near enough by us to not be inconvenienced by the travel and the things that are required. But we have 15 current teachers that are participating in our EPP from Knox, Jefferson, Oak Ridge, Roane, and Hamlin counties. We have a second cohort of teachers in the works that are some late hires for us this year and some new hires for the next year, as well as from other districts. Around 20 of those registered for our cohort next year. I highlighted a couple of things on here just to draw your attention to them. You know, mentoring and coaching is a big aspect of that. And so for each one of these candidates, they have an assigned administrator and an assigned mentor teacher in their school building who are trained by us, who participate in the curriculum. They have some, SREB has some built-in dialogues and things that those new teachers, as they're onboarded at the school level, can get in and talk to their administrators about, you know, how does this work and what would this look like, and they can meet with other CTE teachers and do that as well. And that all of that is in addition to the state requirements for them to visit other classrooms and do things like that as they are pursuing that practitioner lines or practitioner license. Sarah mentioned this, or maybe Amy, that about being able to offer this program at a little bit lower cost. We're actually a teacher who was completing the programs, which had even been cut down, I think, to 12 or 14 hours for the other EPPs. We're probably paying in the range of $5,500 to $6,000 for the coursework, and that's out of their own pocket. Again, I'm getting a cut in salary and I'm paying for my school, coming back to teach. And so we're able to actually do this. We take $100 a month out of the paycheck for 2 years. So 24 installments of $100 for those teachers. And then if those teachers are with us and stay for 3 years, essentially they finish that license, then we reimburse them the $2,400 for their participation in the program. So that's a recruitment strategy that we sort of built in from the beginning. We already had some funds in our general purpose budget that were set aside with the intention. I think the way it was written was for some high need areas like math and special ed and things like that, that if we had a teacher who wanted to add those endorsements and had been working for the district for 3 years, they could access those funds. And the reality was we were very rarely using them. And so I was able to talk with our folks in HR, and we're tapping into that to help support our needs in this area. So that's been good work, but they warned us in the beginning of this that when you launch this, it's like it's schizophrenic because you're partnering with yourself. And we find those all the time about where are we wearing the EPP hat versus the HR hat versus the CTE. So it's a real strange relationship, but it's been good work, as I said. And then this is not directly related, I would say, to licensure, but there's a couple of points I would pull out into this. So this has been work that has been going on since really last spring, the spring of 21. And it began with, during our virtual world, a lot of virtual focus groups and bringing groups from each high school, parents, teachers, and students, community partners, post-secondary partners, business partners together to really reimagine our high school approach, and to think about what were the things we wanted to see our high school graduates as they moved on from us take with them in terms of skills and experiences and plans in terms of post-secondary pathways, things like that. And so we are launching next year with 7 of our 15 traditional high schools a career academy structure that will begin with just a freshman academy next year. Those students are going to get probably intense experience, if you will, but they're going to get a focused experience in a freshman seminar course where they will do some exploration of careers. They will do some exploration of themselves through interest and aptitude tools and aligning those pieces. They'll get an introduction to the future academies that will be available to them in 10th through 12th grade that are going to be career themed and focus heavily on these CTE pathways in their school. But the idea of giving the students a time at their freshman year to really think about how to best utilize their electives and their focus, both for CTE and for advanced academic opportunities. Maybe that's dual enrollment for them, which industry certifications, matter, being able to really cast a picture for those students before they move into their sophomore year of which path is going to be most valuable for me, based on my interests and my aptitudes and my long-term goals, and really just creating the conversation with them early and coming back to it often throughout their experience. The academy structure and the community-wide piece, the partnerships that need to be developed to support this really are about mentoring these students around giving them professional networks, expanding our ability to give them work-based learning opportunities, some guaranteed experiential learning at each grade level. So for that freshman year, we want each student to have a visit to a post-secondary campus. For that sophomore year, some type of industry field trip where they see work in action and they learn about what it means to be at work. And then a more intensive, hopefully in the junior and senior year, job shadowing experience, and then some type of senior capstone piece where maybe they're working towards a high-end industry certification or doing a more intensive work-based learning placement or something of that nature. So kind of guaranteeing those experiences for the students at each level so that they have a progression along with their elective focus that takes them out into that. And I say all that to say that's huge work and it's going to be really slow in building, but so much of it is about building the capacity of our gen ed educators, our CTE educators, our counselors, our administrators, and really trying to put career and technical education, and even I like to back it up a step, just career education. Like aside from this whole idea of it has to be a CTE track, all of our students, no matter what track they go on, are going to end up hopefully one day in a career. And so thinking through that frame of reference of how do I plan, how do I move towards that, how does that become part of what I'm expected to think through and look forward to as a high school student, is really what putting CTE and putting this piece at the main table for our principals and our teachers is about for me. And you know, it's been so easy, as I said, in the past to just kind of on a whim decide what program matters or doesn't, you know, and it's based around personalities and it's based around lots of things. And we haven't always been strategic in our vision for how we're moving through career and technical education. And so, you know, even as I think about, and Sarah mentioned it, we're in a great place in this state in terms of, I think, the backing and the support that career and technical education have, the funding that is currently available and is coming to support that. And that can be a challenge even in itself to execute on all that. And that's just it. Like, without casting that vision, without having the educators on the ground understand it in the right scope, you can throw all the money in the world at it, but they're never gonna bring it down to something that means something for kids. And so the structures and the systems that we hope to build through this work, the education for our educators that we hope comes through this work, is about putting it at the main table. And so I think the same thing when I think about licensure. How do we put the conversation about preparing and onboarding and equipping our school districts to bring these candidates in is going to be crucial, and it has to be as important a conversation as hiring the math teacher, hiring the science teacher. You know, it's all got to be on the same playing field for us to really see the benefit of all the focus and funds and things that are coming down the pike.
Dr. Wilson, you're doing a phenomenal job, and again, it's fun to see how excited and impassioned you and Ms. Williams are about this, and it does change lives, absolutely. So it's encouraging to me to see that we have people like yourself in these seats. I believe the next slide you're going to tell us how we can do a better job of supporting and serving you. If you would, let's go ahead and motor through that, and then I want to jump into Q&A to make sure we've got a few minutes to spare.
Sure. And this is quick because I honestly don't have a lot of really crisp suggestions for you on this. I guess it would be this: when you're looking at, I think, policies and rules that are drafted around licensure, and this comes back to my main table kind of point. You know, there are places in policy, and we talked through some of these this week too. You know, when we're writing them, that we have to think about all teachers that fit into this box, right? So when we think of writing just a generic around licensure, or maybe granting permits is a great example, as an example of that, we have to consider those varying backgrounds. If we're talking about an occupational versus a traditional teacher, we might be talking about a degreed versus a credentialed, or someone who doesn't have a degree. So when you put parameters in things that maybe require a bachelor's degree, by nature of that, you're excluding your occupational teacher who comes to the field that doesn't have that. So I think it's being aware that, you know, our teachers don't always come through those traditional tracks. They don't always bring the same educational background. And we have to be careful that as we're writing, rules and policies that it's inclusive of this wider range of teachers. And then I would say, you know, this has been one I worked 2011 and 12 was involved with a teacher incentive fund grant from the federal government. And we had some pieces in there that were around hard to staff and high need that we could use. And the truth then, and unless I've just missed it now, is that we throw around high need and hard to staff a lot, but sometimes those definitions are kind of squishy in terms of like, what does that mean? And I think that, you know, when I think about these hard to staff, high need, you know, we mentioned a few there earlier. Automotive maintenance has not been one that we've struggled necessarily to hire, but we went through 2 years of trying to hire an aviation teacher for a program, and did hire one on a permit who quit halfway through the year, and probably never would have achieved the license, just to be quite honest with you. But it was, you know, there are areas where we just cannot move. And I think when we find ourselves in those really critical and hard to staff places, you know, that's a place where I would like to see us go beyond the current flexibilities we have with the requirements and things. And that goes back to the quality quantity, you know, the argument. Like, yes, we want to be about quality, but the reality is quite often we're not picking between candidates. If we find one, it may be the one, right? And so like I sometimes it's just a challenge when you again are faced with a desire and a justifiable need even in your economic and workforce, but you just can't find that right fit person. I think that's a place where I would say flexibility could be, and that goes into the alternative pathways. And then lastly, you know, I want to tell you, in Knoxville, we compete heavily for candidates with TCAT. And so when we're finding teachers, sometimes they've taught at TCAT before, sometimes we've just about got them hired and they go to TCAT. We've had that experience too. And that's not a knock on TCAT, but it's to say, again, it shows you how limited this pool is. And when we're trying to hire folks and we think about all the steps and process that they have to go through, right or wrong, that's a challenge, and that's a place that they may opt to go somewhere else. So, you know, it makes us hard to be competitive sometimes, especially in the onboarding phase. And so in talking about some of those places where, you know, I saw when she was sharing some of those state board rules where maybe there's a period of time that teachers are allowed to meet that requirement over, you know, 2 years, 3 years to get there, rather than everything, check every box before you step in. Things like that could be places where it could ease up our competitive or increase our competitiveness with the folks that we're competing with for instructors.
Thank you. Excellent job. I'm going to, again, jump in with a couple of questions. But first, I want to frame a few thoughts. The first one is, and Dr. Wilson, you guys have done what seems to be an incredible job of launching this EPP initiative. Unfortunately, there's a lot of districts across the state that aren't going to have the staffing or the resource to be able to pursue this in the same way that you have. So, you know, all the policies that we evaluate have to also take into account
Sure.
those nuances. So that's one thought. The second thought is, and this is where I want to be, I want to take my board hat off for just a second and kind of put the private sector hat on for just a moment. You know, when you're dealing with a complex issue, one of the first things you have to be very intentional about is to remove assumptions. And we have to identify what are the actual limiting factors or the constraints, the theory of constraints. What are the actual constraints within which we're operating? And sometimes those are identifiable easily and everybody can agree pretty quickly and then you can move on. Other times those actually become the subject of considerable debate where the constraints are more like assumptions. They're not actual truths, and you can actually remove some of the constraints. And this is kind of what I hear you talking about, Dr. Wilson, is evaluating this question of can we remove certain constraints to allow districts to operate a little more fluidly. In this particular case, you know, all the conversation today has focused on, you know, how do we develop someone, get them to the point of them being an occupational educator and having the requisite license and so forth. I want to pause there for a second and say, let's remove that constraint for just a moment. Instead of the goal being to have licensed occupational educators, if the question or the goal really is to have a classroom experience that advances the kids who are participating in the classroom, if that's the objective, maybe having the licensed occupational educator isn't necessarily a box that we have to check. And I want to frame it in this way. If you have someone who's incredibly talented at auto mechanics, for example, but as you've already alluded to, Dr. Wilson, for whatever reason, they may not be willing to engage in the entire process of ultimately getting licensed. But then you also take into account the fact that we have teachers who have the training in pedagogy and who have the classroom experience to be able to manage the 14-year-olds in the classroom and all that comes with it. Is there a world in which we could simply pair them together to effectively give the kids in the classroom the same or better experience without having to require that the occupational talent or contributor goes through the licensing process? And I want to ask that question of the entire group. I'm hearing again, it sounds, and to Ms. Williams' previous point, it sounds like there are multiple pathways by which a person could ultimately become licensed, and that's going to be a great path for some who are dedicated, who really want to become teachers. And it also sounds like we already have some exceptions in place where a license, as I understand, a licensed educator can teach up to, I think it was 2 courses in areas that are outside of their endorsement. So we have some flexibility there, but the question to the group being, can we pair 2 people together? In other words, let's break the assumption that it has to be one person. And let's say if we can pair 2 people together, each of whom bring the requisite skill sets and can collaborate together in that classroom setting, is that another way to create yet another pathway by which the occupational talent can be invited in without having to overcome so many hurdles? And I'm going to ask that just again, blanket question to the group. What objections would any of you have to us exploring that concept?
I had a similar question, and that is there any possibility for a part-time person? In other words, somebody who's actively working in an industry, but would and could be willing to give some number of hours on a committed weekly basis to some coursework. Similar, I think it's a similar question.
I'll jump in first. I think my general philosophy in life is don't say no until there's a question asked. And so I think from a philosophical standpoint, my thought is, well, I think it's worth investigating and kind of seeing what those opportunities are. I think questions I would have that I'd just like some data and some research on is there, when you go into education, we in the high school space, we have very few general education educators, that there is a content tied to it. And so those teachers who have that EPP, we'll say, side of the world, the classroom execution side, in the high school space typically also have a content side. And so I don't know if what the pool of partners there are for that. So that would just be a question that I would have is there somebody to partner them up with? And then the second side, kind of going to that kind of part-time piece, that I think would be worthy of investigating, because it feels kind of, I don't know if this is a taboo word or not, but it feels kind of like an adjunct professor, right? Like not full-time, not but a part-time piece. And I think the investigation there that I think we'd have to really rely heavily on Dr. Wilson and other district leaders kind of across the board, is what does that look like in terms of return on investment for investing those salaries back into the school system as a whole, both for the partnering piece as well as for a part-time piece. And then I think Eric will probably have a lot of thoughts around what does it lends me to ask myself the question, what are the minimum requirements to entrust an adult with 20 to 25 students in high risk, safety wise, but high reward for local community programs, and the juxtaposition between those two things. And I think defining that baseline of what is the minimum requirement, and then how many requirement, one person part-time, two people full-time. I think those get into really interesting operations questions with district leaders. So that's my initial thought.
Yeah, if I can, I'm gonna put a slightly finer point on what I and I believe Mr. Jensen are asking here. Let's assume for a second that they have to have all the typical requirements that they would have to apply for an occupational license. So they have to have the experience, they have to have the industry credentials, they have to have the high school degree. Let's say that they check all three of those boxes. It's just a question of, is there a way for us to invite them in without having to hit them with all of these other things? And then I want to say one other point too, with respect to budget. Maybe some of these folks would be paid by the system, and maybe some of them wouldn't. Maybe there would be sponsoring employers. I will say, as an employer, we have done similar things, although not within the K through 12 system, where we have been willing to pay for our own employees to teach at and instruct in different programs for the primary purpose of getting our name and creating just letting those students know that opportunity exists. So I'm not, again, I'm trying to remove constraints. Let's remove the budget constraint for just a second and say, maybe they're paid by the school district and maybe they're not. So what thoughts do you have, Ms. Williams? Dr. Wilson, would love to hear from you. And Amy, I know that you have thoughts on this as well.
I'll go last. Y'all go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid you're muted, Dr. Wilson.
I'll say, Keith, I'll
sorry.
end my piece with, I think it's a very interesting idea. And I think at the end of the day, the willingness to investigate alternative solutions to solve problems that are continuing to grow and not go away from districts is ultimately in line with doing what's best for students. And I think that's at the heart of what we're all trying to do. So I think it would be an interesting something to dig into.
I have a couple questions, if I may. Oh, Keith, go ahead.
Well, I was going to actually turn it to you pretty quickly, because my thought on what's been described sounds a lot like the adjunct license the pathway that already exists within policy or a rule or whichever one it is that we're looking at. But it allows for, again, a properly industry credentialed person with that work experience to serve in at least a half-time or no more than a half-time capacity, and is renewable for up to 5 years to teach. And there is a requirement to complete an adjunct licensure program, but I know that that's been provided somewhat in-house over time here, and it's basically like an online course or something that's a really basic short. I don't think it's at the scale of that. So again, maybe a modification of that gets closer to what you're talking about, Jordan, but it seems like we have somewhat of a pathway, but like I said, I'm sure Eric or Amy could tell more about that.
Yeah, in terms of the adjunct license, they are completing an approved program for adjunct licensure. So they are receiving some, support in terms of making that transition from their previous field of industry into the classroom. I think that that's an interesting proposal to have something that's in between educator preparation and something like the adjunct license, and that would need to be explored at greater length. Some, questions that I have are around primarily risk management, I think, and thinking about the state board's authority to monitor for disciplinary issues related to educators, and how we would be classifying this person who is not a teacher in this format, and the challenges that potentially opens us up to both the state board and the department for creating that kind of relationship, because the state board wouldn't necessarily have the discretionary authority to enact its rules around teacher discipline if that person's not a teacher. There are also a lot of questions about how that's operationalized in terms of scheduling. The other question that I would have would be, do districts have the ability to pay 2 salaries? And if so, why not just offer that full salary to an occupational educator to incentivize them to complete the already abbreviated occupational preparation programs that exist in Tennessee? So I'm certainly not opposed to, continuing to explore and be part of the conversations about alternative ways of getting occupational expertise into the classroom. But those are some of the questions that immediately come to mind for me.
Yeah, I think as I've been thinking about this, the adjunct license pathway was also what was jumping out to me, which I think would need to be revised somewhat. You currently have to have at least a bachelor's degree to participate. Jordan, I don't know if you or some of the other board members on the call have run into this before. We haven't updated it in a little while, but as it's been stated, it's for an individual who's going to teach up to 3 sections of a course for a year in what's defined as a critical shortage area. So again, we'd have to think about what does that look like with CTE, to Dr. Wilson's point. Complete a program, which we would have to, I'm honestly not sure of the current status of it, so we'd have to look into what the program required. Doesn't sound like it's particularly onerous. And it's an annual thing. It can be renewed up to 5 times, but it's 1 year at a time. And that is a type of license. So getting to Eric's point, I think that this kind of feels like it's an interesting gray area between a volunteer and a teacher. If I want to go and volunteer at a neighborhood school, I typically have to have some form of background check or fingerprinting, or they're doing something to make sure I'm safe to be around students, or I'm not going to be left alone with them. There's always going to be somebody else in the room as well. And then when we have someone who's on a license or a permit, we have much more authority to make sure that if they have some kind of misconduct in District A, they can't just turn around and go to District B, that we take a state level action on them. So I think those are all interesting things. And then there's also just like co-teaching sounds really simple, that you handle X and I handle Y, and sometimes we collaborate. It's really hard, whether you're doing it with a special education teacher, an English learner teacher. There's a lot of different co-teaching models and strategies. So there's some ways that it might actually require more pedagogical training and just really clear definitions of roles and expectations.
If I may, before we, this seems like a topic to me worthy of further discussion at our workday or somewhere. And I'm thinking of, in particular, we've got to have, I think it's 9,000 employees at the Blue Oval City. 4,000 of them are going into the SK battery plant. We're going to have a TCAT on the campus, but there are numerous counties around there with school systems that, to get 9,000 people ready is good. And we don't have the option to fail in this. So I think there's some creativity that needs to occur in order to meet the circumstances that are opportunity. I mean, there are huge opportunities. I mean, what if, for example, if you could get the chief engineer of SK Batteries and his staff come into classes in Hardeman, Lauderdale, and Tipton County on a regular basis? We've got to think, in my mind, we do rules and procedures and there's risk and all that. But I think that's part of our job as a state board, is to look at these things and make recommendations beyond approval of policy and procedure. So I would encourage us to, and there are several other things that seem like in this topic, it need further discussion without, a time limit or a presentation. One of them I wanted to ask Dr. Wilson, if you will, what percentage of your students are in some kind of CTE in your district?
I would say, and I don't have the exact number to say, like as far as participation, we have a lot of kids that sample, right? That pop in and out of CTE programming. I would say that we're probably, when you look at our graduating class, I would say above 80% have taken some CTE class during the time that they're in there. Now, keep in mind that range is wide. That's trades all the way to IT and everything. Yeah,
but that's remarkable, frankly. And one other question, just as a follow-up. Are you talking to parents about, that's one of the things that we've struggled with in a program we got started in Memphis, was the parents were, I don't want my kid, they're going to college. They're going to college. It's that. And we've done that for far too long in our state and around the country. And a lot of kids are going to college, but a whole lot of kids are not. So what are you doing in terms of talking to parents about this?
My answer to that would be not well. We continue to struggle with, I think, painting an accurate picture of the pathways that exist for students outside of the traditional 4-year. And, in Knoxville specifically, we've said this around certain industries, and advanced manufacturing is a great example. We have a very diverse economic and workforce development field. Which allows us a lot of different opportunities. We have programs that are very broad because we have lots of employers and different industries. But because of that, our parents don't. When you say Nissan in Nashville and all the tier 1 suppliers, they understand manufacturing. Well, in Knoxville, it's not that way. So when you don't have these identifiable industries outside of the medical field, education, things like that, people know what those jobs are, and then painting a picture for alternative pathways through apprenticeship, through things like that for parents. I mentioned it earlier. It's a huge education campaign for our teachers and our counselors and our administrators to be able to do that in conjunction with the parent nights that they do and the FAFSAs and all the things that they also talk to parents about.
And I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. I think this is a question we need to ask
reality.
ourselves across the state. What are we doing to continue to discuss with parents? I think the number is 50% of all the kids are not going to college. And to me, we've got huge opportunity to focus families toward a successful career. Again, I've said enough, and again, maybe we have further discussion along all of this at another time. But that's something that seems to me to be a high priority after we get policies and procedures done.
Those are excellent comments and questions, Larry, and I couldn't agree more. I'm going to go ahead and close this out to be sensitive to everybody's calendar. Amy, you may have a couple comments here in just a second. In doing so, let me just emphasize this. Again, it's encouraging to me, and I hope it's encouraging to anybody who might stumble across this video on YouTube and elsewhere, that we have people who are so impassioned about this work and who are so knowledgeable. And I think everyone who's spoken today absolutely qualifies in that regard. Having spoken with them off the record about this issue on a number of occasions, I continue to be impressed. Coming from the private sector, again, I continue to be impressed with the work that Dr. Wilson, Ms. Olmstead, and Ms. Williams, and so forth are doing. I hope that others are as encouraged about it as I am. I do think that we need to be careful to both think outside the box, remove constraints where we can, remove assumptions where we can. But also to Ms. Olmstead's warning, and I know Amy has told me this before as well, we also have to take into account the nuances and the fact that that teachers are that they deal with a lot of challenges, and they deal with a lot of in class, I'll call it cadence that has to be carefully thought through. I believe Ms. Olmstead referred to it as risk management. There's talent. There's a multi-vector series of talents that we need to figure out how to bring together here. I'm not, while we may be the best in the country at it, or close to the best in the country at it, and again, I would commend the work that's being done. I think that we can all agree that there's still more that we can do, and there's still more kids, especially outside of areas perhaps like Knox County, outside of those areas that can create their own EPP. We need to figure out how to create some additional opportunities and pathways for well-meaning and whether they're volunteered or paid, well-meaning people with talent to come in and give inspiration and hope to kids across the state. So with that, Amy, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. There will be conversations taking place with our staff and with members of the Department of Education. I've got a list of things that I'm going to follow up on with a number of people. But Amy, if you could go ahead and close us out, and please do so.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for your participation today. This was a really robust discussion. I know that there's going to be discussions of the study committee of several aspects of workforce development and CTE over the next year or two. So this is a great starting point to start with teacher quality and how can we get the best trained teachers in front of our students. And I do want to pick up on the point that we're having a shifting focus of education in Tennessee. It's no longer college or career, as was stated. Every student will have a career. It's just, when are you starting it, and how can we help prepare you for what you're going to be doing next? We will have a workshop presentation either in May or July on the high school and beyond plans that are in the State Board Master Plan for this year and up through 2025, which would encourage students to not just do a 4-year plan for high school, but also look at their next 2 years. What would they be doing after high school? That's going to have a parent engagement piece. It will have a discussion of their different career programming options. So I think those two things can dovetail really, really well as we move forward. And I look forward to seeing where this discussion takes us. So Thank you all very much. We appreciate your time and have a great evening.
Thank
you
you,
all.
everybody. Appreciate it.